Hey, me back again. Still Friday. Still some stuff to tell you. So I want to talk a little bit in this video about Thomas Beckett, or Thomas Beckett, as he's known to history, who is the martyr that all the pilgrims are going to see. They're going to see his shrine. So again, I'll walk you through where this information is if you want to read it for yourself. Again, I'm just going to relegate myself to the bottom corner. Yeah, so if you're on the class page like this, then just go to the library, and then if you look for the Middle English folder, which I never can seem to find, there we go, in Chaucer, and then there's a file here, Thomas of Becket. Now, I'm not going to read this file to you. Instead, what I think I'll do is I'll just tell you the story. So maybe I'll put myself front and center. The story's going to have more details, but basically Becket was a friend of the king, and the king at the time was Henry II. Henry II was the grandson of Henry I. And anyway, Henry II was had a childhood friend named Thomas, from Thomas of Becket, Thomas from Becket. And they were pretty much party animals. They did what they wanted because they were both extremely wealthy. They were into drinking and partying and doing all these kinds of things. And then eventually Henry inherited the throne of England. And so he wanted to give his drinking buddy a primo post in the new government. And so he made him the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is an extremely powerful post in the British monarchy. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the only person who can crown a monarch in England. And even to this day, all monarchs are crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The oddity, or the irony of it, of course, is that Becket was about as close to being a good Catholic as, well, not very close, let's put it that way. But that wasn't uncommon. Often people went into the church because it was actually could be quite lucrative. So if a nobleman had 4 sons, the first son would inherit the estate, the earldom or the dukedom or whatever. The second son, might work at court, might have an important post at court. The third son might be a solicitor or some other government official. And the fourth son, not having any of these other roles really available to him, would often go into the church and maybe become a bishop or something. And bishops were extremely powerful, extremely wealthy, and they controlled vast sums of money. They had palaces and huge cathedrals. In fact, the thing that makes a church a cathedral is that it's the seat of a bishop. The requirement to be a bishop or to be a religious person wasn't really devotion to God. It was more social influence and just a lack of other things to do. And if you had money, you could basically do what you want. And so that's kind of the thing. So it wasn't that unusual that somebody like Thomas would be appointed to such a high post. The problem started to arise when Thomas actually converted. He actually had a religious experience and became devoted to God, and really decided that he was going to take this job as the religious and spiritual head of the country seriously. And so he started to come into conflict with Henry. Henry was very strong-willed. He had a very large temper. And Thomas started saying things like, well, yeah, okay, you can appoint the archbishop, but I get to appoint kings. And they had some other disagreements about the relative power of the church and the state. And Henry believed that the king was the most powerful person in the country. And Thomas believed that it was the archbishop because he was, at least indirectly through the Pope, the servant of God. And so Thomas would basically get in Henry's hair about a bunch of different things, one of which was the appointing of bishops, right? Remember I said bishops are powerful. So Henry wanted to make sure that the areas in which bishops served were controlled by him, and so therefore he wanted to control who became bishop. Thomas said, no, sorry, I'm the archbishop. I get to decide who the bishops are. And the problem was Thomas was picking people that were religiously devoted. Henry wanted people that were politically cooperative, right? Henry didn't really care how religious they were. Thomas did. So they constantly got into conflict. It got so bad at one point that Thomas left and hid in France because he was afraid for his life. Anyway, fast forward to the year 1170, they're having another huge conflict, and Henry, in exasperation, in a meeting with a number of his advisors, and this is probably not what he said, but the phrase that's come down to history is, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest or troublesome priest and or meddlesome priest? Will no one rid me of this guy?" And it was just a phrase of exasperation, but there were four knights standing there, and they heard Henry say this, and they decided that it was a coded message, and that Henry was saying that anybody who basically got rid of this guy was going to benefit from it, that Henry would reward them. It's sort of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Hamlet being called, and knowing that they'd get a king's remembrance if they could figure out what was wrong with Hamlet. So these four guys decided that they were going to do the job, and they got on their horses. They rode the 70 miles to Canterbury, and they basically murdered Thomas à Becket right in front of the altar in Canterbury Cathedral. And what happened was a firestorm of response. People were outraged. The whole country went bananas, to the point where Henry actually had to publicly apologize, even though he really wasn't at fault. And he even went through the streets where he was symbolically whipped. He was stripped to the waist, and he went through the streets and he was whipped by the priests. And unprecedented action for a king to humiliate himself in front of his subjects in that way. But Henry needed to do that in order to regain their trust. Becket, on the other hand, for standing his ground and not giving in, was made into a saint. And I think it only took about 3 years before the Pope canonized him and he became a saint, and Canterbury became a shrine. So with all saints and all shrines, they are attributed miraculous powers, and so people would then begin to go on pilgrimages in order to visit the shrine and gain from the saints spiritual, miraculous power. And so that's the whole point. By Chaucer's day, pilgrimage to Canterbury was a popular thing. And even if the pilgrims didn't receive a miracle, they would get credit from the church for having gone on a pilgrimage, and that would buy them quite a bit of time out of purgatory. So that's the backdrop of Canterbury and why Thomas Becket is such an important figure. And that's why all these 30 people are headed on their way to visit the holy, blissful martyr. That's all I have to say about that.